Hey everyone, and welcome back to Vaj Academy channel. Today, we're diving deep into the fascinating world of decision making. But not just any decisions. We're talking about the high-stakes stuff, the kind that shapes companies, governments, and even history. We're going to unpack a groundbreaking paper titled Behavioral Strategy in the Wild. Now, this isn't your typical dry academic read. This paper, published in the Management Research Review, is like a detective story, exploring how our very human biases can lead to strategic blunders and, more importantly, how we can outsmart them. The authors Wayne Borchardt, Takhaui Kamzabek, and Dan Lovallo are experts in the field, bringing together insights from business, economics, and psychology. They've taken behavioral strategy out of the lab and into the real world. So, let's get into it. The paper kicks off with a question, a challenge, really. It quotes Daniel Leventhal, asking, "A behavioral approach to strategy. What's the alternative?" It's a bold statement, right? It's like saying, if we're not looking at how people actually make decisions, what are we even doing? This isn't just some theoretical debate. It's about how we navigate the complexities of the real world. The authors then bring in Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's right-hand man, who famously said, "How could economics not be behavioral? If it isn't behavioral, what the hell is it?" Think about that for a second. It's a fundamental shift. For decades, we've been taught that people are rational actors, making perfect decisions based on logic and self-interest. But let's be honest, that's not how we operate, is it? We're human. We're messy. We're full of quirks and biases, and that's where this paper comes in. Borchardt, Kamzabek, and Lovallo highlight this conceptual transition from the idea of perfect rationality to the acceptance of our boundedness. What does boundedness mean? Well, it's the idea that we as humans don't have the cognitive superpowers to live up to those old-school economic theories. We're not supercomputers. We're more like, well, let's just say we're works in progress. This recognition of our limitations has transformed fields like economics, finance, and even strategic management. Now, we're finally starting to consider the impact of judgment and decision-making on the big picture. And that's where the idea of behavioral strategy comes in. Lovallo and Siboni, two of the big names in this field, argue that our subconscious biases, if left unchecked, will absolutely undermine our strategic decisions. It's like having a tiny gremlin in your brain constantly nudging you in the wrong direction. And it doesn't stop there. Other researchers like Gavetti, Greve, and Powell et al. Have expanded on this idea, showing how our cognitive limitations can hinder our ability to see new opportunities, how we repeat past mistakes, and how we misinterpret feedback. Powell and his team even say that we need models that solve the problems faced by thinking and feeling human beings. It's not enough to just have the data. We need to understand the human element in all of this. So how do we fight back against these biases? That's where the Debiasing techniques come in. The authors categorize these into three groups: analytical, debate, and organizational techniques. And that's what this paper is all about, showing us how to use these techniques in the real world. They're going to take us through 4 real-world settings: military intelligence, mergers and acquisitions, resource allocation, and capital projects, and show us how these biases can lead to disaster, and more importantly, how we can use debiasing to make better decisions. So get ready, because we're about to embark on a fascinating journey into the heart of behavioral strategy. We'll see how confirmation bias can lead to war, how over-optimism can bankrupt companies, and how our own biases can blind us to the truth. It's going to be a wild ride, so stick around. All right, let's talk about something that's not just a business problem, but a matter of life and death: military intelligence. Now, you might think that with all the high-tech gadgets and top-secret information, military decisions are always based on cold, hard facts. But what if I told you that even in the most critical situations, human biases can lead to catastrophic failures? As the saying goes, if you torture the data long enough, it will confess to anything. And that's exactly what happens when confirmation bias takes hold. This bias, as we'll see, is not just a minor glitch in our thinking. It's a powerful force that can distort our perception of reality, especially in high-stakes situations. The Vietnam War, a conflict that still echoes in our collective memory, the paper uses this as a stark example of how confirmation bias, acting at multiple levels, can lead to disastrous outcomes. At the highest level, we have Robert McNamara, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, a brilliant manager by all accounts, but his reliance on quantifiable data, on things he could measure and analyze, led him to overlook the qualitative aspects of the war. Things like the motivation, the hope, the resentment, and the courage of the Vietnamese people. McNamara's approach was like trying to understand a painting by only looking at the number of brushstrokes. He missed the big picture, the human element that ultimately decided the fate of the war. He was so focused on the numbers that he ignored the whispers of the human heart. But it wasn't just McNamara. The paper also delves into the Rand Corporation, a think tank that advised the U.S. government during the Vietnam War. Rand prided itself on objectivity, on being a beacon of rational analysis. Yet even this organization, filled with brilliant minds, succumbed to the same bias. Enter Leon Gore and Conrad Kellen, two well-respected senior intelligence analysts at Rand. Both men were highly qualified. Both had seen the horrors of war firsthand. Gore, a Soviet specialist, had a deep distrust of communism. Kellen, a Jewish man who had escaped the Nazis, had a different perspective. They were both given the same mountain of interview transcripts from Viet Cong prisoners and defectors. And here's where it gets interesting. Gore, with his pre-existing beliefs, interpreted the transcripts as evidence that the Viet Cong had lost the fight for hearts and minds. He believed that more bombing would break their will. Kellen, on the other hand, saw the same transcripts and concluded that these people couldn't be coerced. He believed they were simply telling their captors what they wanted to hear. Two highly intelligent men looking at the same data and arriving at completely opposite conclusions. It's a powerful illustration of how our own histories, our own biases, shape the way we interpret information. It's not that one was right and the other was wrong, it's that both were human. As Gladwell put it, that's how intelligence failures happen. It's not because someone screws up or is stupid or is lazy. It's because the people that make sense of intelligence are human beings, with their own histories and biases. And this isn't just a Vietnam problem. The paper points out that intelligence failures are not unique to any one conflict. They have devastating consequences, costing lives, livelihoods, and billions of dollars. The Afghanistan war, for example, cost the U.S. over $2 trillion and resulted in the deaths of almost 250,000 people. So, what's going on? The paper highlights 7 sources of intelligence failures, from a lack of information to strategic deception. But at the heart of it all is individual psychology, our cognitive and motivational biases. It's like we're wearing tinted glasses, and we don't even realize it, and that's where confirmation bias comes in. It's our tendency to seek out and interpret information in a way that confirms what we already believe, while ignoring or dismissing anything that contradicts it. It's like we're building a fortress around our existing beliefs, and we're only letting in the bricks that fit. What can we do about it? The paper introduces a powerful debiasing technique, the red team, blue team approach. This is a debate technique where you create 2 teams, a blue team that defends the current strategy, and a red team that challenges it, actively looking for flaws and vulnerabilities. It's like having a built-in devil's advocate, forcing you to consider alternative perspectives and challenge your assumptions. This approach has been used by the military for over a century, and it's been applied in various sectors, from cybersecurity to capital projects, and it works. The paper highlights the successful 2011 U.S. Navy SEAL mission that killed Osama bin Laden as a prime example. The red team preparation for that mission, which included developing, testing, and refining strategies, allowed them to respond to unforeseen situations, like the crash of one of the transport helicopters. The success of this mission was also the result of a decade of deliberate efforts by the CIA, triggered by the 9/11 attacks. They formed a group of contrarian thinkers known as the Red Cell to challenge conventional wisdom. This group, comprised of creative thinkers with diverse backgrounds, used techniques like what-ifs and pre-mortems to identify the holes in their plans. Even in business, this approach is valuable. Warren Buffett, for example, actively seeks out contrary viewpoints. He even assigns 2 independent groups to represent opposing sides on potential acquisitions. It's a reminder that sometimes you need to challenge your own assumptions to see the full picture. As Buffett himself said, you don't ask the barber whether you need a haircut. So, the story of military intelligence and confirmation bias is a powerful reminder that even the most brilliant minds are not immune to human biases. But by understanding these biases and actively using debiasing techniques like the red team, blue team approach, we can make better decisions, not just in war, but in all aspects of our lives. All right, everyone, buckle up because we're shifting gears from the battlefield to the boardroom. We're diving into the world of mergers and acquisitions, or M&A, where fortunes are made and lost, often with a single signature. And just like in military intelligence, biases can play a huge role, especially one called over-optimism. Now, we all know that feeling, right? That rush of excitement when you think you've got a brilliant plan. Everything's going to work out perfectly, and the future is nothing but sunshine and rainbows. Well, that's over-optimism in a nutshell, and it's incredibly dangerous in the high-stakes world of M&A. The paper starts off with a quote that really sets the stage. Thinking rosy futures is as biological as sexual fantasy. It's a bold statement, right? It's saying that our tendency to be overly optimistic isn't just a quirk. It's baked into our DNA. And when you combine that with the pressure cooker environment of a big merger or acquisition, you've got a recipe for disaster. The authors point out that it's not just confirmation bias that messes with M&A deals. There's a whole cocktail of biases at play. But they decide to focus on over-optimism, and for good reason. It's a big one. Let's look at a real-world example. In 2014, a South African company called Woolworths Holdings, or WHL, bought an Australian department store chain called David Jones, or DJs. Now, this wasn't a small deal. It was a whopping AUD 2.1 billion. The CEO of WHL, full of confidence, announced that they could triple the profitability of David Jones in just 5 years. He said, "We can transform this business." Sounds like a movie, right? Well, fast forward a few years, and things didn't go quite as planned. In 2018 and 2019, WHL had to write off a staggering AUD 1.2 billion of David Jones's value. That's more than half of what they paid for it. The strategic rationale, as the paper puts it, was in tatters. It's like buying a shiny new car only to find out it's a lemon. So, what went wrong? Well, the authors highlight 3 key reasons, all pointing to over-optimism. First, WHL paid a 25% premium for David Jones, which analysts already thought was too expensive. Second, they wildly overestimated earnings. They were expecting a 10% profit margin, but they only got 4%. The next year, they expected 10% again, and they only got 2%. They kept revising their guidance downwards, but they still couldn't hit their targets. It's like they were living in a fantasy world. And third, this consistent failure to meet expectations suggests that the CEO was overconfident and not responding to corrective feedback. It's like they were so convinced they were right that they ignored all the warning signs. The paper then drops a bombshell. M&A deals often fail to deliver the intended performance improvements. In fact, research shows that large acquisitions have only a 44% chance of delivering returns above the industry average. One expert even calls M&A a mug's game, reporting that 70-90% of acquisitions are abysmal failures. It's like playing Russian roulette with your company's future. So, why do companies keep doing it? Well, there are rational reasons, like agency issues where managers might pursue their own goals at the expense of shareholders. But the authors argue that non-rational behaviors, driven by cognitive biases like over-optimism, play a huge role. They bring up the frog prince analogy, where the acquiring company sees a struggling target as a frog that can be turned into a prince with a kiss, or in this case, overpayment. But as Warren Buffett famously said, we've observed many kisses, but very few miracles. The paper also highlights how CEOs, under pressure to maintain high performance, can become overconfident and overestimate their ability to manage the target firm, leading them to overpay. It's like they're blinded by their own success. And the more deals they do, the more overconfident they become, creating a vicious cycle. So, what can we do about it? Well, the authors introduce us to a technique called the Mediating Assessments Protocol, or MAPI. It's a meta-debiasing technique that combines reference class forecasting with other debiasing practices. Think of it as a structured, step-by-step approach to decision-making that helps us avoid the pitfalls of over-optimism. We'll dive deeper into MAP in the next section. But for now, let's just say that it's a game changer for anyone involved in M&A. This section is a powerful reminder that even the smartest people can fall victim to their own biases. But by understanding these biases and using techniques like MAPI, we can make better decisions and avoid costly mistakes. Stay tuned for the next part where we'll explore resource allocation and anchoring bias. All right, let's shift gears for something a bit more familiar. Resource allocation within a company. Now, you might think that deciding where to invest a company's money is a purely rational process, driven by strategy and careful analysis. But what if I told you that a sneaky little bias called anchoring often throws a wrench into the works, leading to inertia and missed opportunities? Think of it like this. Imagine a ship stuck in the mud. It's not that the ship is broken, it's just that it's anchored to the spot, unable to move forward. And that's exactly what happens when anchoring takes hold in resource allocation. The paper uses Nokia as a prime example. Back in the early 2000s, Nokia was the undisputed king of the mobile phone market. Their Symbian operating system had a whopping 65% market share. They were on top of the world. But then, something happened. The smartphone revolution. Apple's iPhone and Android devices started to gain traction, offering a whole new ecosystem of apps and services. But Nokia, despite being a tech giant, failed to adapt. They continued to focus on low-end feature phones and their outdated Symbian operating system. Why? Because they were anchored to their past success, to their existing business model, and to their established way of allocating resources. They were like that ship stuck in the mud, unable to break free from their anchor. By 2010, Apple's App Store had 300,000 apps, Android had 130,000, and Nokia just 30,000. Symbian's market share plummeted, and eventually the operating system was discontinued. Nokia's failure to allocate resources effectively in the face of changing industry dynamics is a classic example of anchoring at play. And Nokia isn't alone. The paper points out that many companies fall into the trap of peanut buttering, spreading their resources thinly across all areas of their business, with little or no benefit. It's like trying to butter a whole loaf of bread with just a tiny pat of butter. You end up with a mess, and nothing gets properly nourished. Studies have shown that the most successful companies shift more than half of their capital across their business units over a 15-year period, earning significantly higher returns than those that don't. It's not about sticking to the status quo. It's about being flexible and adapting to changing market conditions. So, what's causing this inertia? The paper identifies several factors, including the sunk cost fallacy, status quo bias, corporate politics, and, of course, anchoring. But of all these distorting factors, anchoring has been shown to be the most robust bias. So, how does anchoring affect resource allocation? The paper highlights 4 key reasons. First, last year's budget serves as a ready and justified reference point. Second, our initial judgments carry significant weight, and we don't react sufficiently to new information. Third, anchoring is reinforced by loss aversion. And fourth, we value things more when they belong to us, otherwise known as endowed anchoring. It's like we're so fixated on last year's numbers that we fail to see the opportunities and threats that are emerging in the present. We're so attached to our existing resources that we're reluctant to let go, even when it's clear that they're no longer serving us. So, what can we do about it? The paper introduces a powerful Debiasing technique, the CEO Piggybank. This is an approach where a large contingency fund is set aside to seize opportunities, whether to nurture existing businesses or acquire new assets. It's like having a war chest ready to deploy when the time is right. The CEO Piggybank helps managers become less anxious about underperforming units, so fewer resources are directed to fixing them. This frees up capital to be invested in high-growth areas. It's like cutting away the dead wood to allow the new growth to flourish. The paper highlights Lee Raymond, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, as a prime example. He required executives to identify 3 to 5% of their asset base for disposal each year. This forced them to justify the resources they needed, and it helped identify non-strategic assets. Similarly, Alan Lafley, the former CEO of Procter & Gamble, divided the business into 3 categories: future stars, local jewels, and underperformers. This allowed him to prioritize investments and divest from underperforming businesses. And the results speak for themselves. During Lafley's and Raymond's application of the CEO Piggybank, Procter & Gamble and ExxonMobil each doubled sales and more than quadrupled net profit. So the story of the resource allocation and anchoring is a reminder that our past successes can sometimes become our biggest obstacles. We need to be willing to challenge our assumptions, break free from our anchors, and adapt to changing market dynamics. Now, let's move on to the next bias, the planning fallacy, and see how it plagues capital projects. All right, everyone, let's talk about something we've all experienced, whether it's planning a weekend trip or a massive construction project. The dreaded planning fallacy. It's that sneaky little voice in our head that tells us everything will go smoothly, on time, and under budget. And it's almost always wrong. In this section, we're diving into how this bias affects capital projects, those huge undertakings that demand massive resources, and what we can do to avoid falling into its trap. The section starts with a quote that's both funny and a little sad. We learn from history that we learn nothing from history. It's a bit cynical, but it really hits the nail on the head when it comes to capital projects. We keep making the same mistakes over and over again. The authors point out that capital projects, whether it's building a new train line or a government building, make huge demands on resources. And that's where the planning fallacy comes in. It's like this invisible force that makes us underestimate how long things will take and how much they'll cost. Let's look at a couple of examples. First up, the California High-Speed Rail Project. In 2008, voters approved a 150-minute train route from Los Angeles to San Francisco with a budget of $40 billion and a 20-year construction period. Sounds reasonable, right? Well, fast forward to today, and the timeline has been repeatedly pushed back, and the budget has ballooned to a staggering $100 billion. That's more than double the original estimate. It's like that project is a runaway train and no one can stop it. And if that's not dramatic enough, let's talk about the Sydney Opera House. It was supposed to be finished in 1963, costing $7 million. But it ended up being delayed by 10 years and costing a whopping $102 million. It's like they were building a monument to the planning fallacy itself. The paper then throws some pretty shocking statistics our way. Research on IT projects between 2005 and 2020 shows that less than one-third were completed on time and within budget. And get this, the average cost overrun in public projects ranges from 24% to 96%, and overruns of 100% or more are not uncommon. It's like we're living in a world where projects are expected to fail. So what's going on here? Why do we keep underestimating task completion times and costs? Well, the authors say it's primarily due to the planning fallacy, where we don't adjust our predictions enough, even when we know that previous projects took longer than planned. It's like we're living in a bubble of optimism, ignoring all the historical evidence. The planning fallacy is like over-optimism, a manifestation of our inside view behavior. But it's different because the optimism persists even when we have past evidence that contradicts it. We focus on the best-case scenario, ignoring all the potential roadblocks and alternative scenarios. It's like we're telling ourselves a story where everything goes perfectly, even when history tells us otherwise. So, what can we do about it? Well, the authors introduce us to a technique called reference class forecasting, or RCF. It's a way to get an outside view by gathering information from previous, similar projects, regardless of their success or failure. It's like learning from the mistakes of others instead of just focusing on our own optimistic plans. RCF is a structured approach that helps managers forecast project estimates using reliable top-down estimates of true costs, schedules, and benefits. It's like a reality check for our overly optimistic brains. The authors outline a 5-step process for RCF, which involves selecting a reference class of past projects, assessing the distribution of outcomes, estimating the project's position in that distribution, assessing the reliability of the information, and then correcting the initial likely biased estimate. And the good news is that RCF is gaining traction. It's mandatory for large infrastructure projects in several countries, including the UK, Denmark, Germany, and the US. And it's making a difference. In the UK, for example, the average cost overrun of large public projects was 38% before RCF. But after adopting RCF, the probability of completing projects within budget increased to 62%, and cost overruns were reduced to just 5%. That's a huge improvement. This section highlights the power of the planning fallacy and how it can lead to massive project failures. But it also shows us that there are practical techniques, like RCF, that can help us overcome this bias and make more realistic predictions. The key is to learn from the past and not let our optimism cloud our judgment. All right, we've journeyed through the fascinating world of behavioral strategy, exploring how cognitive biases can derail even the most well-intentioned plans, and how debiasing techniques can help us make better decisions. Now, let's bring it all together with the conclusion of the paper and the summary of debiasing techniques. The authors pose 3 key questions in their conclusion. 1. Is behavioral strategy coming of age? 2. Has it moved from the lab into the wild? 3. Do strategists recognize the need to take a behavioral approach to strategy, acknowledging their susceptibilities to behavioral biases? The answer, according to the paper, is mixed. On one hand, we've seen profound strategic decision failures that were at least partly due to cognitive biases that went unchecked. On the other hand, we've also seen promising successes when debiasing techniques were deliberately applied. This demonstrates that debiasing can indeed improve the quality of strategic decisions. The key takeaway is that strategic managers need to debias their decisions. The success cases provide evidence that debiasing can work, while the failure cases show that not debiasing can be disastrous. Leaving strategic decisions to chance is both foolhardy and irresponsible. The authors urge humility as a foundation for practical, proven debiasing techniques. It's about being optimistic, but not overly optimistic, and recognizing our own limitations. The paper summarizes the debiasing techniques into 3 main groups: organizational, debate, and analytical. Organizational techniques. These techniques focus on changing the structure and processes of an organization to mitigate biases. They often involve leveraging System 1 thinking, which is automatic and effortless. Examples include 2-level governance, a governance structure to challenge the decision team's investment decisions. Having 2 layers of decision helps catch flawed judgments that make it past the decision team. Mediating assessment protocol incorporates reference class forecasting and other debiasing practices, such as postponing the use of intuition, using relative scales, and benefiting from the wisdom of the crowd. CEO Piggybank, an approach to budgeting in which a large contingency fund is set aside to seize opportunities, whether to nurture existing businesses with additional capital or to acquire new assets at knockdown prices. Tripwires, development of an early warning system that triggers one to act when certain predefined conditions are met. Incentives motivation establishes financial and non-financial reward policies for an accurate estimate of project and also establishes punishments for inaccuracies. Share financial responsibility. Budget, cost overruns, and benefit shortfalls are shared between proposing and approving agencies. This reduces the agency problem driver of the planning fallacy. Debate techniques. These techniques involve structured discussions and challenges to encourage diverse perspectives and reduce biases. They are often more popular among practitioners. Examples include red team, blue team. 2 separate teams develop competing recommendations on a proposal. One group, a blue team, investigates with a view to proposing the project or investment, while another, the red team, builds a case against the project or investment. The independent decision maker decides based on the opposing cases presented. Mandatory alternatives. A rule whereby every team or individual proposing a project for approval is required to propose not 1, but 2. As a result, yes, no, or whether or not questions are outlawed and it becomes normal, not exceptional, to see projects being rejected. Advanced checklist, what would need to be true? In advance of the facts of the proposal being known and discussed, the decision makers agree on the criteria they would require to be true in order for the decision to be made. Pre-mortem, the leader asks the group to imagine themselves in the future in which the project they are considering has been a total failure. The group is asked to consider the reasons that it went wrong. This serves to elicit weaknesses and risks. Consider the opposite. What if we're wrong? Consideration of alternative hypotheses by asking, what are some reasons that our initial judgment might be wrong? If this was your money, an exercise in which each participant is asked to allocate funds, assuming this is their individual portfolio, not corporate funds. Re-anchoring. Debate on cases where there is a large discrepancy between history, i.e. this year's target, and model, and to allow a discussion in which large amounts are reallocated. Done using an outside set of forecasts, e.g. competitor benchmarking. Additional downside. The rule of thumb to apply this approach is to add 20%, 25% more downside to the most pessimistic scenario, and then decide whether the plan is still viable. Unpacking a task, an exercise in which participants break down multifaceted tasks into precise subcomponents. Unpacking helps to consider undercounted components, and will provide a longer and more accurate forecast. Analytical techniques. These techniques involve using data and analysis to make more informed decisions. They often rely on System 2 thinking, which is deliberate and effortful. Examples include qualitative scenario analysis, informs decisions by developing a set of qualitative, representative scenarios of alternative futures and identifying the likely consequences of the decision under consideration. Test, learn, adapt. A systematic policy of piloting concepts in advance of full rollout. Instead of trying to predict the future, test a potential solution actively by trying it on a small scale. Periphery scan. Include learning from the past, e.g., what have been our past blind spots? What is happening in these areas now? Examining the present, e.g., what are your mavericks and outliers trying to tell you? And envisioning new futures, e.g., what emerging technologies could change the game? Inertia benchmarking measures the correlation between the percentage of resources each cell, e.g., division, in a portfolio received in the most recent year and what it received in previous years. This draws attention to whether resource allocation is too stable. Reference class forecast. A method of forecasting based on a sample of relevant comparable cases. Requires explicitly creating a large enough reference class, often from the experiences of other companies. Similarity-based forecasting. An application of reference class forecast where reference classes are not weighted equally, but by similarity. It's important to note that these techniques are not mutually exclusive. In fact, the paper points out that debiasing techniques are often combined because biases in the real world also often combine. By understanding these techniques and applying them strategically, we can make better decisions, avoid costly mistakes, and achieve more successful outcomes. This paper serves as a valuable reminder that behavioral strategy is not just a theoretical concept, but a practical tool that can be used to improve decision-making in a variety of real-world settings. It's a journey of continuous learning and improvement, and by embracing a behavioral mindset, we can all become more effective strategic leaders. And that concludes our exploration into the fascinating world of behavioral strategy and debiasing techniques. We've seen how cognitive biases can lead to flawed decisions, and more importantly, how we can actively counteract them to make better choices. By embracing a mindset of humility and applying these practical tools, we can all become more effective strategic leaders. Thank you for joining us on this journey of learning and growth. Be sure to subscribe to Vaj Academy for more insights into the world of business strategy and decision-making.